Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for waiting a little bit. We had some technical issues that are resolved now, but welcome for this session number 3 about the monument perspective. Is also already mentioned in the first sessions at some moments that well, we know it all. Churches are also monuments, and they have the heritage values that they share with everyone, but they also have sometimes an official status as a monument in the local different legislations. So that means that sometimes it gets subventions for restorations and so on. But also sometimes there is a protection on this kind of buildings that gives some limitations in the use or the reuse of the churches. In this afternoon's session, we have 3 approaches of this problems. I'm Jan JASPERS. I was working for PARCUM, an organization in Flanders that was as a center of expertise and the Museum of Religious Art and Culture. And we developed a planning instrument for municipalities about what choices you can make when you have to choose for the churches that are still open for worshiping. I will present this this planning instrument, and I also will give you the more general context of legislation and where does it come from. So we start with the French Revolution of all moments to explain this, and then the second is Marieke Kuipers. She is she was professor at the University of Delft, but also has a large experience and still is active in the heritage field. And she will talk about the carrying capacity of these ancient buildings. And she gives a lot of examples of new uses in the Netherlands. And the last intervention is from NOTT CAVIEZEL. He is a professor at the University of Vienna, the Technical University of Vienna, and his perspective is the combination of monument status and the sacral aspect. And Johannes will be our guide through this. He is my co-chair, and will he guide us technically and also practically through this session. Maybe Johannes, you have to say something more about that.
Very briefly, I'm responsible for the chats as a co-chair, and I will try to find out questions, filter questions, and then ask them in the discussion. So you're totally free to use all the options. If you would like to use the chat on your right-hand side, you can write your questions there. If you click on the icon, the chat icon, then you can write your questions. If you don't want to be distracted by this, you can deactivate it again. If you write anything, please be very short and precise. I will then take these and collect these questions, and we'll ask them in the discussion later on.
Thank you very much. So let's start with the 3 presentations. And I will be the first to guide you through this first presentation. Next slide. Okay, this is the title of my presentation. It's the Parish Church Plan and the cooperation between the municipal governments, the central church administrations, and the individual church councils. Next slide. Well, about 200 years ago, the Catholic Church was thoroughly shaken, not only in France, but also in Belgium. And churches and monasteries were expropriated, and the ecclesiastical property was forfeited. The practice of worship was impossible, and the once powerful and wealthy church had also almost no means of subsistence. religious buildings were sold and given a new profane purpose. Next. In 1801, Napoleon and the Pope, Pius VII, concluded a concordat that allowed Catholic worship to be practiced publicly again. In this concordat, the Pope recognized the sale of ecclesiastical property. And in return, ministers of the worship receive a salary from the state. And the unsold parish churches are handed over to the municipalities and made available to the bishops for the practice of public worship. The municipalities were responsible for the maintenance of the church buildings, and the bishops were ordered to set up church committees, fabrique d'église in French, and still the term that is used in Belgium at the French side of the country, to provide material support for the religions. The organization, operation, and powers of the church committees were regulated by the imperial decree of 1809. Next. Now, this decree was further applied in Belgium from the independence in 1830 and transposed into federal and regional legislation. And as a result, the ecclesiastical and civil authorities in Belgium must, in consultation with each other, take care of the religious heritage of the publicly recognized religions. The church committees play an important role in this matter from their historical mission of supporting worship. In what follows, I concentrate on the situation in Flanders, the northern part of Belgium, and specifically on the Catholic region, which currently composes almost 94% of the recognized religious communities or parishes with 1,595 parishes. Next slide. From a large-scale study carried out in 2013 by PARCUM, the Museum and Center of Expertise for the Religious Art in Flanders, I get a few more figures to illustrate the situation of the parish churches in our region. In 2013, Flanders counted 1,786 recognized parishes. 7 years later, there are still 1,595 or 191 less. This reduction is a result of the merging of parishes for pastoral reasons. During the same period, some 80 churches were withdrawn from worship and given a new purpose. Almost all parish churches are included in the inventory of valuable buildings drawn up by the Immovable Heritage Agency. And as already told before, 53% of the churches are also officially protected as monuments, either completely, 38%, or partially. That means, for instance, the oldest parts of the building, the tower, and so on, 15%. Next. The majority of these churches, that means 90%, are in good or decent physical condition. This is to the credit of the church committees who take their responsibility to maintain the church buildings to heart. In addition to their own resources, they can appeal to subsidies from the Flemish government for both protected and non-protected churches for maintenance and restoration projects. In many cases, the municipality also intervenes to cover the deficits. Next. But Flanders too has not escaped from the evolution in the field of worship. Research by the Flemish government in 2011 showed that approximately 5% of the population still regularly participated in the Sunday celebrations, but also that the number of Roman Catholic priests decreased. It was concluded from both trends that most of the churches were too large for the remaining faith community, or that there were too many churches in relation to the number of ministers of the religion. It cannot be denied that financial considerations also formed the basis of the government's analysis. As a result of Belgian legislation, both the Flemish government and the municipalities invest in the management of the buildings of the recognized religions. However, political support for these investments is declining, partly as a result of less dominant position that the Catholic Church has occupied in Belgium in the recent years. Next. In consultation with the bishops, the Flemish government formulated a number of recommendations in the concept note, A Future for the Flemish Parish Church, and announced amendments to the existing regulations. Here's note dates from 2011. One of the recommendations was to develop a long-term vision of parish churches for each municipality in Flanders. In this long-term vision, later called the Church Policy Plan, it would be indicated per municipality which churches would still be used for Catholic worship in the long term, and which would be qualified for secondary use or reuse. PARCUM, then still CRKC, was charged with the establishment of a center of expertise for the management of immovable church heritage. Next. The concept note of the Flemish government only gave a broad outline of the content and the procedure of a church policy plan. That is why PARCUM developed a practical model in consultation with the ecclesiastical and the civil government services. Because the church policy plan became a condition to be able to receive subsidies for the restoration of listed churches in the future, the Immovable Heritage Agency of the Flemish government published an inspiration memorandum in 2019 with an explanation of the minimum requirements for such a plan. Next. The concept note of the Flemish government when drawing up a church plan, a policy plan, a consultation at the level of municipality is assumed. This consultation is jointly directed by the ecclesiastical and civil officials, who together form a steering group, and this steering group coordinates the activities and keeps the process going. Next. The church policy plan is primarily based on the pastoral needs of a local church community. Formulating these needs is an exclusive task of those responsible for the church and leads to the preparation of a pastoral plan. This plan describes how pastoral care will be organized and how many and which buildings will be used for this in the short and the medium term. Are all these buildings completely necessary, or is there a possibility that some of them could also be partly used for other social purposes? Which buildings are no longer needed and can therefore be reused? At the same time as formulating the pastoral needs, each of the church building is described and analyzed. This description contains the following elements: the cultural historical value of the building, the architectural possibilities, can there be adjustments made to the building to make it suitable for a secondary or a reuse, and the current physical condition of the building. Is the building in good condition, or are major maintenance and restoration works required? The location of the building in its spatial environment is another aspect. Where is the building located? Is it easily accessible by individual or public transport? Is there parking nearby? Is it still surrounded by cemetery, and so on? And then in the last aspect is the current use. Is it still used for worship? And is it also used for cultural or social purposes? Or is it no longer in use for worship? Next. PARCUM's vision on drawing up a church policy plan also attaches great importance to participation. This means that at regular points in the process, the opinions of parishioners and citizens in general are sought. In this end, contact moments are organized and there is a communication about the progress of the consultation. The purpose of this is to ensure broad support for the church policy plan. Next. When both descriptions are ready, the pastoral plan on the one side and the description of the building on the other side, it's determined in the consultation which churches in the municipality concerned will be used for worship in the short and in the long term, and which are eligible for a partial or complete alternative use. The plan also contains an action plan. That means an agreement on how the church policy plan will be further followed up and implemented in the coming years. And then the consultation process ends with a formal approval of the plan by the bishop on the one hand and by the city council on the other hand. This also gives the plan an official status. Next. By the end of 2020, in Flanders, the church policy plan had been completed for a total of 240 out of 300 municipalities. Next. It could be of interest to know whether or not the monument status can be an argument to keep a church for worshipping. An in-depth research on that topic is not done yet, but in the practice, we see that other, more practical considerations are taken in account when choices are made between different churches. In the first place, the location. Is the remaining church central enough in the new formed parish? Can it be reached easily, also with public transport? Is there a parking place nearby? In the second place, the inner space of the church. Is it large enough to receive a larger number of parishioners? Is there a good view on the altar from everywhere? That means, are there no pillars, for instance? In the third place, is it in a good physical condition? And can it be used without major adaptations or restorations? And if you combine these arguments, choices are made for more recent churches, say 20th century churches, and the older buildings that are protected as monuments are handed over again to the municipalities. Thank you for your attention. I think I give the word now to Marieke with her presentation.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? For me, it is a bit strange because I don't see my screen. Yeah, it's over here. Well, as you have heard already from my colleague, former colleague, I must say, Albert Reinstra, there's a lot of context for the Dutch history and the church buildings. And far before the French Revolution, we had the Reformation, which already caused huge effects for repurposing religious buildings. For instance, our universities used former monasteries. But nowadays, also the remaining age-old city churches have remained in use as a place of worship. But the challenge is to find sufficient funding for their maintenance. And that is huge because we have a strict separation between church and state. And therefore, each religious community, and you have heard already how many there are, must each finance their own conservation. And that is a very huge challenge. And that makes also that even highly valued monumental churches dating back from the Middle Ages need to find interventions for additional or other uses in order to survive economically. Yes, next. And this means that also in the course of the 20th century, the position of the historic church buildings has changed dramatically, both in the cityscape and in society. For centuries, for example, the High Dome Tower in Utrecht has been the highest building in the whole of the Netherlands, and it was the self-evident landmark of the city. But today, most high-rise buildings are the secular size skyscrapers with a skyline of Manhattan as a widespread reference image of modernity. And where cathedrals and old churches were the result of the collective efforts over long spans of times with successive generations in which they were involved, the construction of a new skyscraper can be realized within a few years and be privately financed for commercial aims. So this creates another kind of competition, you can say. Yes, next. And therefore, the question raises if all reuse or architectural interventions can be permitted, because the process of secularization is going on, and new subsidy regimes for monuments care to test the financial carrying capacity for the maintenance of those churches. They have become very weak, one can say. And we were very late in officially, legally protecting the old church buildings. So there were hardly any options to prevent demolitions if a building was not officially protected. And so, for instance, as you can see on the left, the Koninginnekerk in Rotterdam was demolished in order to make place for a home for elderly people. And in Dordrecht, as you can see on the right, there was an age-old church called Nieuwkerk that hardly escaped from demolition by being converted into partly apartments and a cash and carry. And later on, people protested because those shopping carts were driven over the former gravestones, and that was not very respectful, as they said. And the problem is for us not only the lack of finances, but also that in conservation, the general guidelines only provide indications about the don'ts, and they hardly give any indications for what could eventually be allowed. And therefore, I think that there are also new concepts needed. For instance, the cultural carrying capacity, called draagkracht in Dutch, and the cultural elasticity, or spankracht. And maybe this can help also to find acceptable forms of secular use and create suitable architectural interventions. In conservation, it's always about matter and meaning. And there's the relation between the tangible and the intangible. And that is the special position for a sacred space that used to be the one for church buildings. Yes, next. And as you can see right now, there's 1 to 5 church buildings in the Netherlands adapted for other uses. And they have lost their original function as a collective place of worship. And the problem is not only that they are relatively recent churches that are now used for other purposes than just worship, but also the more old ones. Yes? Next, please. And we also have 2 traditions that are not always helpful for respecting both the age value and the sacred value, because we have that reuse tradition since the Reformation, but we also have, and here the old guidelines from the Dutch Archaeological Union, where you see here the example of IJsselstein, where there was a new church tower invented by Michel de Clercq after the original one had been destroyed by a fire. And this was the kind of rule that was accepted prior in the interwar period. And in the Netherlands, we were lucky that we had not all those awful destructions of the Great War. But so therefore, it was easy to accept those principles and regulations in 1917. So we had no official Monuments Act, but we had those rules for conservation. And one of those rules was that additions should be recognizable as contemporary unless there are sufficient sources available for a historically reliable reconstruction. So there was already a sort of tendency to promote the contemporary in order to avoid false replications, so to say. Yes, next. And here you can see after the Second World War, the new situation where you can see a lot of actors, factors, political society, regulations, design, finances, and well, the ongoing challenge to find an appropriate use for a church. The Rotterdam Laurens Church has hardly escaped from the total demolition after the inner city of Rotterdam was bombed. And after a lot of discussion, it was decided that it should become both a church and also a multifunctional place for the inner city people. And for that last purpose, Wim Quist had added 5 cubes, as you can see here. And that was in use for the total story. But in the late 80s, there was another idea for repurposing the whole interior. And so recently it has been changed again to become a monument full of stories. And it had then been a discussion whether these cubes should be removed or not, because the idea of layering of time was not by everyone accepted. But now it has been, and it also creates for me the question that's not only about not to distract from the original monument, but also how we can judge the quality of the combination of old and new. And so I started to search for a new kind of vocabulary or interpretation for how people would judge these combinations. It was already common in the ancient times that a Romanesque or Gothic church could be completely different after an intervention for a Baroque tradition. But how was it in the post-war period? Yes, next, please. And that means also that it is a challenge to value an age-old church as heritage. Is it different? And if so, why? What are the consequences for reuse? And can we give per church or in general a definition of what is the cultural carrying capacity? We have already seen various examples of reuse for shopping, a supermarket, but there are also a lot of examples for private living. And this, both commercial use and private living are the less advantageous solutions for the carrying capacity, because it is not continuing the idea of community. Yes, please, next. So I will not list all the names and ideas that are on the right, but I think that it is very important that we can formulate what makes a church this special place. You have already had people who say it is only the house of God, and just for that reason it is sacred. Or people say it's a community house. And there are also the tensions between age, patina, or that you want to show the comparability of the things. And finally, you can also think, is it a place of contemplation or can we also invest to have a better comfort, especially when it is very cold in winter? You need heating. And then you have the commercialization, which is also a challenge to manage. Yes, next. And so I've tried what kind of forces are there in the clash of the capacity for the continuity and change when you are looking for a secular reuse. I think it is always a very critical balancing act between the significance of the place, both for the tangible and intangible values, and the design challenge to create something new for the new use. That should not always be very big or very expressive, but often it is in the Netherlands. Yes, next, please. And the same is true for this idea of elasticity. We have already seen that, especially 19th century churches are now already reused for sports functions. This morning, the church in Maastricht had already been mentioned, the Kruisherenkerk, which you see here in the middle, which is also more or less privatized, but also accessible, if not in the times of Corona, but if you want to go there to the restaurants, you can go there. And you can also see that this idea of showing off the contemporary of the new architecture comes to a kind of competition with the already existing old one. And that is, for me, also a challenge if you educate both the client and the architect, who they can relate to this age-old tradition. And therefore, I think that the idea of decency and dignity is equally important in the whole long search for adaptation. Yep. Next, please. And therefore, I think that there's another term relevant, which is compatibility. It used to be mostly relevant for the material side, but I think that it is equally important for the cultural side. And so you can see if compatibility will work out. Please come back to the previous one.
Is this the right slide, Marieke? Just to let me know, because we had here some issues that it's not the right slide, but I have here Wäre Grote Kerk and a timeline. Is that correct? Can you
No, you need to go back 2 slides now.
This slide?
One more?
Yep, this one.
Okay, here we are.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So, yeah, so here you can see what kind of compatibility you can judge. And it is more than just a famous slogan of the modern movement, that form follows function. It's much more than how to integrate in a formally place of worship. And I think that that relates both to the immaterial and the tangible values. And I have tried to summarize just a few. I think that light, the excess of light, is also very important. And you can also add a lot more. Yes, next, please. And now I have 4 examples. Here you have the Nieuwe Kerk in Amsterdam. It was one of the very first city churches that became almost reused for secular use, but it's still in use also for a church. So it happened that our crown prince had his marriage there, and also that our queens and, well, now the current king has been inaugurated there as such. And at the same time, there are now many exhibitions held. And for that reason, there had been a lot of technical interventions like floor heating to make it all possible. And it changes a lot, but the organ is still there. There can be rehearsals, and so it has kept still its function also for worshipping and culture. Yes, next. Veere is a special case because due to the French Revolution, it had lost its function already by the end of the 18th century and then become religious again. And in the 21st century, there had been already several interventions. And this is also because Veere is a very small place and it's an important monument. But if there's no more the great community to contribute for its maintenance, it must seek for other solutions. And when it became the Podium Zeeland, designed by Marx and Steketee, they really sought the coherence with the history and yet use respectful modern architecture. And now recently they have found a new owner and went to by the newest technology, also come to this idea of experience with a church master and use of projection and so on. Just next, please. In Utrecht, there's a very strange mixture that they have reordered the interior of the church. You may know that this whole part has been demolished by a storm a long time ago. And so now it's only the transept that is being used for the church and as a place of worship still. But to raise income, they have now added a tea room and used very modern materials and forms that are in a contrast with this idea of reversibility. But for my personal view, it is of a low design quality, and well, you may have then some problems with this idea of compatibility, I would say. But they have also invited a new artist to make new doors, and he was still in that same spirit of continuity. So if you are constant, you can find add-on layers that can keep on this quality. But here also is a strong, maybe Albert knows more about it, plea to reconstruct the vanished main part, the nave of the building. And I would think that that is conflicting with the whole idea of what has been done in the meantime. So I think that here there's a great need to find a total view for the use of this very, very important church. Yes, next. And Arnhem is also a very special case. Like in Rotterdam, this church was for a large part demolished during the war. And here they had decided to rebuild the tower and also to have new gargoyles, which were inspired by Disney and Tonder in order to be contemporary. And of course, they were not at all religious. But now the church has also become mostly redundant, and they have started to install a new panorama lift, as you can see on the left down, so that tourists can easily reach those gargoyles, and they willfully sought the contrast for super Dutch modernity. And very recently, they have added glass balconies so that you can come even closer to these Disneyfication elements. And that I find still a bit too much. But therefore, I feel myself that I was raised in a very light spiritual tradition. But yeah, this is a kind of exploitation that comes at the edge of what the cultural carrying capacity of a church can have. Yes, next, please.
Marieke Kuipers, I have to interrupt you. I'm the timekeeper, the co-chair, Johannes. How long we should come to an end, because
yeah, well, this is my last slide.
Oh, thank you. That's fine.
So that was just what I wanted to tell. I think that it is very important that you educate the designers and others to balance the spiritual significance and use value. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marieke, for this very interesting presentation. We now listen to NOTT KAVIEZEL and to his presentation.
Dear colleagues, the German comedian Karl Valentin said, everything has been said, but not by everyone. So I see myself in this light. So please take my contribution as an essay or an additional statement regarding many things which were already addressed today: participation, community encounters, sustainability, everything. All of these are important points. So today I do not want to discuss further best practice examples, of which we've seen a lot and probably will continue to see a lot. I instead want to maybe raise a basic question, a fundamental question. The history is being continued. The chronicle, the timeline of the disappearance of churches, which we have seen over the last decades, and we've seen a lot of signs for it as well, so we cannot be really surprised today. There is a general secularization process, and of course there are economic reasons for that, but also the decline in membership, and so a lot of people responsible have challenges. As a church, with all of its members, but also regarding their buildings when they no longer serve their original use. Monument preservation agencies are also involved, of course, because church buildings are often buildings, listed buildings. In Austria, all buildings which are in public ownership of the state, of the federal states, of the municipalities, but also of the church, are based on statutory presumption, are listed monuments. They are placed under preservation order. Mostly in Europe, listed churches are not only owned or responsibility of the church, but also of the public monument preservation agencies. Both institutions, the church as well as the monument preservation authorities, have difficulties with renovation efforts, and there are tensions regarding the services or the reuse which is compatible with the church. And there we have a variety which does not have to be arbitrary. There are a lot of legitimate and suitable uses. So that is my perspective on the situation regarding churches. But how to progress when a church is no longer a church? It is still a church building which is standing there, but through a profanation or deconsecration, it is no longer serving its original use. Which parameters do we have to respect when these buildings are supposed to receive a new use? What sacrality remains, this special characteristic of churches? Should the public authority, the Monument Preservation Authority, even consider these aspects, or is it enough to consider the artistic, the historic, the architectural aspects of these buildings? I hear students asking in exercises about church preservation or reuse through profanation, when they often ask, is it permitted? Is that allowed? Are we allowed to reuse a former church in such a way that this sacrality is lost completely? This justified question of young architects who want to train in monument preservation, of course, cannot be answered by a simple yes or no. This question shows us how difficult it is to find answers beforehand, what sacrality even is and how it is expressed in a church building and how it is presented in a church building. Then, of course, we have trips to philosophy, sociology, theology, psychology, etc. Even though these some of these disciplines are not, sadly, a staple in our architectural studies. The exalted, the sublime, the mysterious aspects in church buildings was often written about in different disciplines, and so I do not want to go into disciplines of which I do not know enough. But I think that before we have a reuse, depending on the era, the convention of the period of creation of a church, depending on what makes it different in its architecture and how its sacrality is affected directly or indirectly, the question of sacrality should be integrated into a stocktaking of the building. These insights can then be included in discussions about a reuse after profanation. We know that sacrality in architecture has long been transferred from sacral buildings to profane buildings, cathedrals of arts, temples of money and of power. Those are the terms which promote sports stadiums or banks. So the aspect of sacrality is included here. We also have football gods, for example, or soccer gods. So these terms for public relations which create emotions, they come from the sacral aspect. But this is not what interests us. The sacrality, as difficult as it is to determine what it consists of, in the history of architecture, in criticism, it is often used to describe profane architecture. Ivar Birnitz, in his very readable doctor's thesis with the title Nahe Ferne, the close distance, has tried to to avoid pathos and pithy gestures. He has written about architects Kahn, Zumthor, for example, and he's tried to determine how their profane buildings include sacral aspects, and how they also offer transcendental aspects for people who long for sublime architecture. He examines this in a very believable way. So in these contemporary buildings of profane use, like libraries or baths, we do have a mix between profane and sacral architecture, which we'll also see under reverse circumstances and other reasons in buildings, in sacral buildings later. But let's continue looking at church buildings, and at the 20th century, when the rejuvenation efforts of the church had a direct influence on the design of church buildings. New spatial perspectives, which focused on simple and pure architecture, developed even before the Second World War. After the war, the church architecture evolved further because there was a great need for church buildings. So it became a playground for architects who developed new perspectives on spatial perspectives, on dimensions, and they used it as an experimental field. So the plastic aspect joined the simple aspect, and multifunctionality as well became an important aspect. So there were entire parish centers where profane and sacral aspects merged, the service merged with the societal or social aspect. Let's remember that before the Second Vatican Council even, and its far-reaching decisions, churches had been built which had a modern perspective on the participation of believers. So the altar became more central, and the pews were placed around it. During the council in 1960 until 65, Johann Georg Steu in Vienna built the Center Oberbaumgarten, and then in 66 to 68, Josef Lackner built the Council Memorial Church, the Konzilsgedächtniskirche. Both churches or church buildings have a square layout with a centrally located altar, and they are proof of a rationalism which has a suggestive message of irrationality. Both churches and many others from the 60s and 70s were built for the long term, for eternity. And in retrospective, we can be surprised how optimistic the church as a builder, just like the architects, were expecting a prospering church and did not expect that the Second Vatican Council would not provoke a lot of churchgoers, an increasing number of churchgoers. But at the same time, there were also different tendencies, which also assumed that there could be a day when churches would not be needed at a certain place.
Walter Maria Förderer was a proponent of this trend, and he developed a number of various churches and he actually called them buildings of a high uselessness. And he showed it in a sketch, like this church in Eremons, built between 1967 to 1971, how this could be repurposed to a tourist center. In Austria, the architect Ottokar Uhl does something similar in building housing and putting an emphasis on participation as a focus element. And these theories are often very radical in his buildings. This montage church, they were always very flexible buildings from the beginning onwards, quite cheap and quite flexible in their use. And they were quite far away from traditional images of church should be. So it was logical that his partly prefabricated churches can be used in many ways and that look rather profane and less sacred. And he said the churches just have to be some kind of frame where the congregation can come together, and the sacred is then limited to the liturgical actions and they could take place anywhere. The sacred and the profane, they are usually mutually exclusive, but they are mixed in the churches of Ottokar Uhl. And Ottokar Uhl in 1963 received the State Prize of Austria in architecture. So this brings me back to the question if the monument protection, what this has to do with the churches that are still there. And I believe there is no panacea. There is no way to give this a final answer. You always have to look at the individual case. I believe that coping with a profaned church, a deconsecrated church, this has to be something which can be quite simple. There are some basic principles of maintenance and of keeping certain buildings, of preserving them. There will be specific answers, and they will probably look for solutions that may be reversible, that do not that cannot be reversed. For example, have a house within a house principle. In smaller buildings, the original idea, the first impression of the space is often lost. And this is one of the important elements of a sacred space. Deconcentrated churches after the Second World War, they are often a mix of the profane and the sacred, and they are oftentimes more in danger than older ones. There we have to be especially careful. A reuse project can change things in a specific way to make sure that the new use is profitable and functional, and you have a balance between these things. So there is nothing that speaks against this principle. It's quite easy to use it. And a new use also provides opportunities. And maybe we should also encourage and animate architects to use what is already there and to build on that, to use what is there, to use the old and to make it new, to use qualities of historical traditional buildings, especially with buildings built after the World War. As long as the monument protection representatives are involved in this, then we can at least try to preserve the aspects that were already there and defended. In 1905, Georg Vehy held a speech for the Emperor's Day in Strasbourg, and he said that the work of art and the monument is always something of a double nature, And what you wanted to say is that the spiritual and the material are always interconnected and you cannot separate the two. The deconsecration takes away the spiritual dimension? Well, maybe, but there will always be an immaterial aspect together with the substance. It will always be an integral part of the monument. We've already talked about the concept of integrity. What does it mean, integrity? It means keeping something intact. In this case, this means material integrity, but also spiritual integrity. And this is both immanent in the monument. There is a message from the past in the contemporary in this building. So material and spiritual values are always linked with each other. They are interconnected. In order to understand this, you don't have to be religious yourself, but you have to have a certain knowledge and empathy for these elements, for these aspects. And beyond the classical monument protection, they need to take this into account when you plan and you use. Also, and especially for buildings built after the Second World War, be it Catholic or Protestant ones. Of course, you always have various possibilities, and this means that a reuse of former church buildings is a very interesting challenge, not least because despite a profane use, it's not the case that anything would be possible, but it is still a monument with an inherent message from the past. Thank you very much.
We have heard a lot of interesting ideas in the presentations, and I wonder in which way what you said not can be connected with MARIEKE's ideas about the spankracht or the draagkracht of the building. If you think about this sacral aspect of the church, is this what can be defined by this idea of spankracht and of draagkracht in the churches?
Do you want that I will explain some more, or is
this
okay, a question for NOTT?
If you want to start, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I came to this a long time ago because in conservation, as the name says, you want to keep what is there already, while knowing that a building, also churches, will change. And in the Netherlands, we have now various new instruments that can guide processes for adaptation or change. And Albert Reinstra knows much more about it. But I thought also that you need to introduce new concepts, like this idea of carrying capacity, not only for, let's say, the mechanics or the finances, but also for the cultural aspects that can include this idea of spirituality. It's not necessary that it is pure sacred and related to religion, because indeed churches have for centuries already been used also for concerts or other cultural events, conferences. But I was really shocked when I discovered that a church, even a very old church, could be reused as a supermarket. So one of the reasons to look at the idea of cultural carrying capacity was also to look at the very old churches. Maybe the Netherlands is ahead of other countries, but for us, that is a new experience, that even those churches that were already seen as the major monuments are now at risk, because the financing of the maintenance is very complicated. And the other risk is that a lot of people have no idea anymore what a church and all the related traditions implies. So, well, they think, why can we not install toilets in the middle of a church, on the very place of a previous altar? And I think, well, there is the cultural carrying capacity really in the core of the discussion. And if indeed church per church we can indicate when there is a need for such reuse, that where potentials lay, we can create better options for their future.
Okay. NOTT, do you want to add something to this?
Yes, just a very small remark. I'm very grateful to MARIEKE KUIPERS for this idea of the carrying capacity. I like this idea of carrying capacity. This concept, this word tells us what's inside in a building, what it can carry. Yes, I mean, you can see it in a very literal sense, but also in a figurative sense. And I believe architect understands that. This carrying capacity of a building in its meaning, in its purpose. This is something which may not be always understood, or may be forgotten or ignored in some cases. And this is why I emphasize so much this immaterial dimension of the monument protection and of conservation. I would be a bad colleague if I were to say bad things about my colleagues in the field of monument protection. But the first mandate is to conserve buildings. And so, of course, you watch for this, what is already there. And I mean, that's the correct approach, to look at what's already there and try to preserve it. In the substance, you have this very much alive carrying capacity. So I would like to say that this immaterial meaning, this immaterial carrying capacity, that this receives the same importance as the material substance. And when we talk about churches and repurposing churches, then of course the question is extremely important right at the start of any discussion, with the various examples we have seen, fitness centers, with dumbbells, or maybe shopping malls, or maybe a meeting point for the elderly. Well, there are so many things. And I believe there are many things that will probably do not really work with the sense and the purpose of the original structure. And I believe the ideas that I've heard today, well, you can take these and maybe make a checklist, or maybe a guideline, or let's call it principles, to work with them for the future, that this is a very important orientation in order to have some kind of orientation in this field. I know it's difficult, and I also know that a public use, a private use, the sale, at least all these are very important framework conditions and can be very different. You can't, have the same solution in each and every case. But I believe many things are possible also in protected buildings and listed buildings, if you observe certain principles. I mean, it's just like ABC of the conservation if you look out for that.
Your intervention was the idea of Zwecklosigkeit. I mean that we always think that when a church is underused, and what is meaning underused, when is a church underused, that we must look for a new purpose. But can a church also
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. I am always speaking from the perspective of monument preservation and listed buildings. And there, sometimes it is enough to say there's a monument, but it is just as important, and we all know that, and many of you have said it already, that even a monument is better preserved if it is used. And the question is, what is a suitable use? And I think for churches, not every use is suitable. I'm referencing this wonderful data bank that Johannes Stückelberger has collected for Switzerland and has created a sort of rank of a ranked list, so to speak. What is helpful, what is suitable for the reuse of many churches in Switzerland. And of course, the best thing is to use the church, to continue to use the church for ecclesiastical purposes. Maybe not a service or mass, but social work of the church, or mixed use, of which we've also heard a lot. I think that is a great recipe to strive for mixed use. Profane use is of course also possible. We have seen a lot of examples there. Depending on which hardcore profane use you suggest, you can destroy a church, not only in its appearance, in its historicity, but also in its original sense or purpose. I believe there is a rank. I believe there is a hierarchy. And I think we can balance that. We need to express these things. We will not be able to generalize them, but I think it would be helpful for churches that are no longer in use as an orientation if we had a guideline or principles, fundamental principles, which of course cannot be only determined by monument preservation authorities, not only by the church, and not only by the congregation who has to find the funding. So it can only be done jointly. And I believe that everyone can learn from the other parties. And I think the winner is the church which had not been used. Thank you, Johannes. Maybe we can see what the chat says. Yes, well. I transferred the chat to a Word document. We have 6 pages. So a lot of questions. Interestingly, in this session, many have introduced parallel discussions where people have reacted to one another and not propose or not ask specific questions to you. So, general remarks. You will find below in the chat 3 dots, horizontally placed dots. If you click on them, you can see that there is a possibility to save the chat and to export it to your desktop. This addresses all of you who've not been able to read everything. And maybe this discussion, which has taken place in parallel, can now be can then be saved. So I want to now pick up on a topic which was raised concerning the lecture by NOTT CAVIEZEL. It is something special when monument preservation is addressing the term of sacrality. It's not its core business, so to say. It is more the responsibility of theologians. So a theologian is asking this. My simple question, perhaps too simple question, to monument preservation responsibles. Is there a discourse among you? To what degree monument preservation, monument protection, eo ipso, has a religious dimension? To what degree, to what degree it can consider this this aspect of dignity of a venerable tradition? Okay, so the question, it goes to all of you. May I react to that? I want to remind you that around 1900, when the monument preservation science that was discussed at the time, that at the time they talked about piety. Monument preservation was supposed to be pious. So there we are very close to religion. However, piety was also understood, I think today you would say, respect. And I think that is the common term used in monument preservation. You have to deal with these buildings in a respectful way. So this origin of respect is in this pious perspective, and we are very close to the original purpose of a church here. And in a discourse which we like to ignore today or forget today, I think that respect or piety is a part of our work as in monument preservation since at least 100 years, and it should also be continue to be a part of it. And I think you do not have to be religious to see that, but you have to know about the history of religion, of architecture, and in cultural history. If you do not have this knowledge, then you have to acquire a profound knowledge, and you will discover many things which will aid you in your daily work in monument preservation. Okay, one question regarding this speech by Jan Jaspers. When is a church no longer in use or no longer needed? How do you define this need? How do you measure a need? It's a very good question.
It's difficult to indicate. It depends on the local parish or the local priest, together with the bishop, to decide if a church is no longer in use. And that means, and that's a little bit, that's why I asked this question about Zwecklosigkeit. In my personal opinion, the use of a church is larger than the liturgy or the masses that are served in daily or every week or every month, whenever. It's also this kind of sacred place. And then is the question, when is the sacred place no longer in use? When is it not visited anymore? And the problem is sometimes that it's a question of whether the local parish is still has still the capacity to open the church and to put it to disposal of the community. And whenever the church is closed with a key and no longer accessible, I think then the problem raised, and then because of that, the local parish and the local priest decide, no, this church is no longer in use, so let's propose to take it out of the service.
I want to also add a discussion which was talked about in the chat, where people said that multifunctionality is nothing new, that it always existed, and that you can simply continue this tradition. But somebody also said that this multifunctionality is especially interesting when it has the sacral religious aspect, but also other functions. We do not have a lot of time anymore. Jan, do you want to speak again? Do you want to maybe invite the other two to speak as well? Not long, because I have to add a little bit of information in the end.
Very interesting ideas that I think that gave a good input to the discussion, because of the connection that they made between the signification of the building that is wider than what we see, and the future use of and also the actual use of the building. I think this can help maybe to go further in the discussion, and I want to thank them very much for their contribution.